Shalom, and welcome back to Parasha Highlights and Insights. This is Rabbi Avraham Fisher speaking to you today from my home in Beit Shemesh, uh, talking to you about this week's Parasha, which is Parashat Vayigash. Parashat Vayigash uh, resumes our story, as it were, in the middle. Uh, we left off the last Parasha with what could only be described as a cliffhanger. Just to remind you, the special cup that Yosef uses was discovered in the bag of Binyamin, the youngest of the brothers. And the brothers were taken back to Egypt in order to face the consequences. Now, it was planted there. Yosef told his servants to plant it there, but nevertheless, it looked as though Binyamin was a thief. And of course, the consequence of this could be dire. Uh, the brothers initially said that we will all be your slaves as punishment. They certainly had no desire to go back all the way to Canaan to their father Yaakov without Binyamin. That was very, very clear. That would be disastrous. Binyamin and Yaakov were very, very closely connected to each other. But the closing line of the last parasha of Miketz had Yosef saying, certainly not. There's no reason why you should all be slaves. Whoever in whosever bag the cup was found, that one person will be my slave. In other words, Binyamin, and the rest of you. And this is so ironic the way he says it. You return in peace to your father. Would not be in peace if they were to return, because it would cause anything but peace for Yaakov to see that all the brothers have returned without Binyamin. And that's the way the last parasha ended, with this statement. So what's going to happen next? What's going to come next? Well, let's take a look at our outline of the parasha to see what happens. Okay. So the first thing that happens is that Yehuda steps forward. Of all of the brothers, it is Yehuda who steps forward to argue, to plead the case for Binyamin. Yehuda has emerged in the past sections of the Torah as the natural leader from among all of the brothers, the one that the brothers listen to the most. He has there's something personal about the way about he carries himself, the authority with which he states things, that the brothers are willing to follow along. And so Yehuda steps forward in order to argue Binyamin's case. And the first thing he does is he asks permission to speak before this person who is in charge of the food. They don't realize, of course, that it is Yosef. And he says, among other things, that you are like Paro. In other words, on a simple level, that means you, as far as we are concerned, is the highest authority in here in the country, and as far as we're concerned, you're on a level with Paro. You certainly have the authority of Paro. So please allow me to speak. And it's at this point that Yehuda repeats most of the significant events that brought them to this moment. He reminds him that you asked us whether we had another brother or whether we had a father, and He doesn't mention the accusation that they were accused of being spies. He leaves that part out. He says, but you asked if we have a brother, and we told you that we were originally 12 brothers. One of them is no longer with us, ironically. He's actually talking to the one of whom he's saying no longer with us. He's talking to Yosef. And one of them is still at home with our old father, because he's the youngest and his father is very attached to him. And you said that we must bring him down to you. Um, and and uh, and so we told our father this when we returned back to Canaan. We told him that in order for us to come back to Egypt again, if we are to purchase food, we must bring Binyamin with us. And our father said, well, I've already lost one son. I've lost Yosef. As far as he's concerned, Yosef had been attacked, torn by beasts. It's interesting to keep in mind that many of the things that Yehuda is saying, we know about because we've been following it in the Torah, but this is in many respects the first time Yosef has heard what went on in the conversations back in Canaan. And so Yehuda continues and said that the person who's in charge of the food said that we may not return unless we bring our youngest brother with us. That was one of the very, very strict conditions that were laid down. Our father says, mentioned Yosef, mentioned that I don't want to lose Binyamin. If you take him from me and something terrible happens to him, then that will definitely bring about my death in sorrow. And so Yehuda continues, if I were to return right now without Binyamin, no matter what the reasons, if I were to return without Binyamin, their souls are so intertwined, he'll die. And many of these things that Yehuda is now saying to Yosef, Yosef is aware of, except, as I said, the exact way that the conversation took place back in Canaan. And then Yehuda adds a detail that you could argue took Yosef by surprise. Yehuda says, I took personal responsibility for Binyamin. Before I left, I said that if I do not bring him back, then I should be considered by you, my father, as a sinner for my entire life. And Rashi had explained there that means that I should be punished both in this world and in the next world. And therefore, concludes Yehuda, because I absolutely cannot return without Binyamin, because I took responsibility for him. Therefore, I should remain here as a slave in Binyamin's place. I took personal responsibility. I became like a co-signer on a loan, and we can't allow Binyamin to default on the loan, so I will take care of it myself. I will be here as a slave. That detail that the brothers, especially Yehuda in particular, were not willing to abandon Binyamin, that they were taking personal responsibility for him, that is something that arguably Yosef did not expect. You could argue that Yosef expected the brothers to have to remain in Egypt as a slave, or for Binyamin to stay and for them to stay with him, or for him to argue, to insist that they bring their father down as well. But when Yosef hears what Yehuda is saying, he can no longer contain himself. He's not able to contain himself any longer, and his response has a few parts. First of all, as he tells everybody who's around, all of the Egyptians who are around him, everyone must leave. He doesn't want anyone there, and that's because he intends to reveal his true identity to his brothers. And he says, he starts to cry, and he says, "I am Yosef. Ani Yosef. I am Yosef." No doubt, up until this point, Yosef has not uttered a word of Hebrew. Up until this point, he's been speaking in Egyptian, and there's been a translator between them. But at this point, he speaks to his brothers in their language, and of course, the brothers are dumbfounded. They do not know how to respond. They don't really understand what's happening, and he tells them to come forward. And again, he repeats, "I am Yosef. I'm the one you sold down to Egypt." But this is all part of Hashem's plan. Hashem has sent me to be here, and don't be sad that you sold me here. Don't be regretful, because it was all part of God's plan to have me here in position to save our family during the time of famine. And the famine isn't over. They're only in the second year of the famine. There are another 5 years, and so I'm here for that purpose, to save our family as well. Don't think that you sent me here. It's really Hashem who has sent me here. Obviously, I have great authority and power here, and so the next part of his response is, it is now time to bring the family, the entire family, down to Egypt. Go up to Canaan, go up to our father, in order to bring everyone down to Egypt. Of course, tell father about me. Tell him that I'm alive. Tell him that I am the one who's in charge of distributing the food, and that this is the perfect place for you to be during the years of famine. He points out to him, he points out to them, that they will live in the area called Goshen. Goshen is a part of the land of Egypt, which is advantageous for Yaakov's family on a few levels. For one, it's good grazing land, and Yaakov's family's income economy is based on shepherding, taking care of the sheep and the goats and so on. So it's good grazing land. So it's good for them. It's also good because although it's close enough to the capital city, it is not a place where many Egyptians live. And Egyptians don't like to live or to be very close to shepherds, as we see several times in all of this. The Egyptians regard shepherds as a kind of an abomination to them. And that also is to the advantage of Yaakov and his family, because it means that they will be financially secure, but they will be distanced from the influences of Egypt. And Yosef knows all too well what a difficult place it is to maintain one's identity in Egypt. So he says, "I will support you here, Father. All of your families, bring them all down, and they will live here. And you see with your own eyes who I am. You can make out with your own ears." Rashi says that because I'm speaking to you in Hebrew, you know who I am. And there's a great deal of crying, relief, of joy, of kissing each other. Yosef and Binyamin cry because they're the closest. They're the closest brothers. They share not only a father, but they also share a mother. So they're very close. And of course, they haven't seen each other in many, many years. And then they speak. to each other. All of the brothers speak, and we can only imagine what kind of conversations went on at this point. Conversation to try to explain things that have been unclear for many years. The word gets back to Paro that this is the case, that it's actually Yosef's family that are here, and Paro is only too happy to invite Yosef's family to come down to Egypt. And he echoes what Yosef had said that you're going to bring your family and they can live in the best place in Egypt. And that is fine. And Paro also gives an order to Yosef to take wagons and to use those wagons in order to transport the family, all of the members of the family. But yeah, Paro says, do not worry about your possessions, your fine or your small possessions, because there's no limit as to what you can acquire here. There's everything here. So take the people, of course, take your animals and so on, but and use all of the wagons that I'm sending. Almost sound like royal wagons, to go back to Canaan and to use them to bring your father and your family, women, children, all the way back here to Egypt. And so Paro gives the order that these wagons be given to Yosef for his brothers. Before they return to Canaan, Yosef prepares his brothers for the trip. He gives them provisions, food for the way, and he also gives various gifts for his brothers, extra gifts for Benjamin, his closest brother, and also special gifts for Yaakov, for the father, all different kinds of provision and gifts that they might need for the trip. And he reassures them, don't worry, I'll take care of you. And his final instructions are, do not waste any time along the way. Go straight back to our father, tell him everything, and then come back to live in Egypt, here in Egypt, in Goshen. And so the brothers returned to Yaakov. They returned to the land of Canaan, and of course they have to tell Yaakov what has happened. And of course, first thing they tell him is that Yosef is alive. And not only is he alive, but he is a ruler over all of Egypt. He's a very important, powerful person in Egypt. At first, Yaakov doesn't believe them. He's been mourning for Yosef for 22 years. Is it possible that Yosef, his beloved son Yosef, is still alive? And then it says that he saw the wagons. And when he saw the wagons, he says his spirit returns to him. Chazal say it means also not only his joy of life returns to him, but also his Ruach HaKodesh, his divine inspiration returns to him. And he decides, yes, Yosef is alive. I must go to him while I'm still alive. Why did the wagons show him this? It's possible that the wagons may have carried insignias from Egypt, which only somebody of great importance could allow to leave the land. But Chazal say, and Rashi quotes this, that the reason why the sight of the wagons is what restores Yaakov's faith that Yosef is still alive, is because the word for wagons, agala, is very similar to the word eglah. Eglah is a young cow, a heifer, and Chazal say that the last topic in halacha that Yaakov and Yosef studied before Yosef left was the topic of the Eglah Arufa, the halacha of the heifer. The case is that the Torah is talking about, that the halacha talks about, is if a body is found and it is not clear who is responsible for the death of this person, that the closest city has to take an eglah, a calf. It's actually a little older than a calf. It's a heifer, and bring it to a certain place and decapitate it and declare we are not responsible. We did not cause the death of this person. Symbolically, this mitzvah is saying that there are times that one has to take responsibility, one has responsibility for events that occur, even if one is not directly the cause of it, but if one has a position of authority, of importance, then things that happen in within one's authority ultimately are one's responsibility. And that could be partially the thought that has been plaguing Yaakov all this time. Am I responsible for whatever happened to Yosef? But the fact is that the wagons symbolize or remind Yaakov of the last Torah that they studied together, Yaakov and Yosef, and that is what restores Yaakov's belief that indeed Yosef is alive. And so he decides it is time for them to go down to Egypt. And so Yaakov and his family, in its entirety, begin the long journey down to Egypt. And this is really the last time that Yaakov is going to be in the land of Israel. Along the way, the last important place that he stops before leaving the land of Israel is Beersheba in the south. And in Beersheba, he offers sacrifices to Hashem. It may be difficult to have divine contact in Egypt. Egypt is a land of idolatry. And so when he offers these sacrifices to Hashem, Hashem speaks to him. And among the things that Hashem says to him is, do not be afraid of going down to Egypt. I will be with you. I will see to it that you will be safe. And ultimately, I will be with you both when you go down and when you come back up. Now, Yaakov, as in his lifetime, will not come back up to the land of Israel, but he will come back. His body will be brought back when he will die. But it also alludes to the fact that Hashem accompanies the Jewish people wherever they may go in galut, in exile. He goes down with them. He returns with them. And he even says, Yosef will be with you at the end of your life as well. And so Yaakov and his family continue the journey down to Egypt. The entire family, men, women, and children, of course, all of the animals as well that they had acquired. He brings them all down with him. And they all go down to Egypt. And it's at this point that the Torah gives us a summary, a list of the people who are in Yaakov's family. And it says, and this is a significant number, that Yaakov's family in its entirety comprise 70 souls. And that's a number that we're going to refer to time and time again, because it's a very large, extended family, if you will. But this is also the beginnings of the Jewish people. And as a nation, 70 is not very many people. But as is said many times later on in the Torah, when they came down to Egypt, they were only 70 people. But by the time they would leave in the time of Moshe, there will be many, many more. They'll take a census and find out that just counting the men between the ages of from the age of 20 and above, there will be over 600,000. And so that is a remarkable achievement. So this is the beginning. 70 souls. Now the 70 souls are broken down by the mothers, by Yaakov's wives. They're the children of Leah and the children of Zilpah, and then the children of Rachel, and the children of Bilhah. The Torah gives a list not only of the children of Leah, but also the grandchildren of Leah. And when we count all of them, together, all of the descendants, let's call them, of Leah, children of Leah, is 33. And as Rashi points out, if you count up the number, it's actually only 32, but there's a 33rd, and that is Yocheved. Yocheved, who is going to be the mother of Moshe. Yocheved is the daughter of Levi, and the reason why she isn't listed among those people who went down to Egypt is because she was born as they were entering the land of Egypt. So she's included in the number, but her name isn't mentioned because she's only born as they enter. And then the children of Zilpah are 16. Two children of Zilpah and their children, altogether is 16. The children of Rachel are 14, and the children of Bilhah are 70. Altogether, that is 70 souls, Shivim Nefesh, who go down to Egypt. As they're making the journey down to Egypt, Yaakov sends Yehuda ahead to prepare where they're going to live. Rashi gives two levels of meaning for this. One, Yehuda will go ahead to prepare the residents to make sure that the place where they're going to live is suitable. But the word that's used, lahorot, also indicates instruction, as in Torah. And therefore, Rashi says that another thing that Yehuda is meant to do in order to prepare the place for their new residence is it's going to be a place of Torah learning. In other words, Yaakov sends Yehuda ahead to establish a place of learning, a Beit Midrash, a yeshiva in Egypt, because the Jewish people cannot be separated from the study of Torah at any one time, and therefore, even before Yaakov and his family arrive, Yehuda is to set it up. And then we have the historic final meeting for the first time in 22 years between Yaakov and Yosef. We're going to talk about that meeting in more detail at the end. We find out that when Yosef knows that his father is coming closer, that Yosef harnesses his chariot so that he can go and meet his father. And then there's an encounter between them that involves crying, and we'll talk about that crying later on. But Yaakov certainly says, "Well, now I can die because I have finally seen you." He is going to live for another 17 years in the land of Egypt. Yosef gives instructions to his brothers. He says it's very important that when you appear before Paro, that you tell Paro, tell anybody who asks, that your profession is you are shepherds. That's very important because in that way you will live in the land of Goshen, which is where I want you to live, and that's a good place for all the reasons that I gave before. And so when the brothers have arrived, Yosef presents his family before Paro. He takes 5 of his brothers, not all of his brothers, but 5 of his brothers as a representative group to meet Paro. Um, uh, it's possible that the 5 brothers that he presents are the weaker looking brothers, so that Paro does not think of employing them for anything like serving in their army. And when Paro asks Yaakov, "How old are you?" he says, "I am 130 years old. I've had a difficult life, and I haven't lived nearly as long as my father and my grandfather. His father Yitzchak lived to be 180, and his grandfather Abraham lived to be 175." And so Yaakov blesses Paro, the king of Egypt, which is to show his gratitude for allowing them to settle in the land. And so Yosef sees to it that his family is settled in Goshen. The specific section of Goshen is called Ramesses, and Yosef is in charge of supporting his family for the rest of the time that they're there. We then have a description, a detailed description of how Yosef supervises the sale of food during the years of famine. And this is important because of certain precedents that Yosef establishes. At first, they buy the food that they need. The people of Egypt buy the food that they need with money. But when the money is depleted, then Yosef exchanges food for livestock. They give their animals in order to purchase food. And then when the livestock is used up, the people offer their lands and themselves, in other words, as slaves, in exchange for food. Yosef only does part of that. He purchases the land on behalf of the crown. Uh, in other words, the entire land of Egypt, or almost the entire land of Egypt, becomes the property of the pharaoh, of the king, of the throne. And this is important. That means from this point on, for the rest of Egyptian history, there is no real private property. Everything really belongs to the government. Yosef relocates the population so that they can be in a good place to receive the food that they need. The one exception is the lands of the Egyptian priests. The land of the Egyptian priests are not affected. They retain their lands. They retain their portion. And then, since the land belongs to the crown, so anyone who lives on the land, who works the land, is essentially working for the government. And Yosef sets up a system whereby the people will be provided with seed to plant the land, which must mean that the famine is coming to an end. And 1/5 of the produce will go back to Paro, and the other 4/5 remain theirs. 20% flat tax for the government. And this whole system becomes the law in Egypt, that the land belongs to the crown, to the throne, and 1/5 goes back to Paro. The Parasha concludes by telling us that Israel, meaning Yaakov and his family, all settle and are actually prosperous in Goshen, in the land of Egypt. And that's where we will leave Yosef and Yaakov and the brothers at the end of Parashat Vayigash, before we proceed to the next parasha, which is the conclusion of Sefer Bereshit. But let's look back at that fateful meeting between Yaakov and Yosef. Vayesor Yosef merkavto. Yosef really harnessed, I think would be a good translation, his chariot. And as Rashi points out here, he did so himself. He didn't wait to order anyone else to do so, because he's showing great honor for his father, that despite Yosef's important position, he takes care of this himself. So Yosef harnesses his chariot, and Vaya likrat Yisrael aviv Goshna, and he went up towards Yisrael, his father, to Goshen. Vayera elav, and he appeared to him. The question is, who appeared to whom? So Rashi, we'll look at Rashi's position first, and then we'll see another one. That is the position of the Ramban. He says that Vayera elav means Yosef appeared before his father. Yosef nira el aviv. In other words, Yosef made himself, he presented himself before his father. That's Rashi's reading. And then Vayipol al tzavarav, he fell on his neck. Vayevk al tzavarav od. He fell on his neck and he cried on his neck od. So this translation says that od means a good while. He cried a great deal. And that's more or less the way Rashi understands it. After this, Yaakov, Israel says, I can now die now that I've seen you, that you are alive. But as for this crying, so Rashi says that this word od means crying a lot, crying a great deal. Hirba v'hosif b'v'chi yoter al haragil. He cried a great deal, even more than usual. According to Rashi, when it said earlier that he appeared to him, that means Yosef appeared to his father, and therefore, when the very next phrase says he cried, we're continuing with the same subject. Yosef appeared and Yosef cried. According to Rashi's reading, it means that Yosef cried, and he cried a great deal. But only Yosef cried, according to Rashi. Rashi continues, Aval Yaakov lo nafal al Yosef v'lo nishako. But Yaakov did not fall onto Yosef's neck, and he did not kiss him. Yaakov essentially stood there during this time. Why? So he quotes a statement from the rabbis that at this time, Yaakov was reading the Shema. Very simple understanding of this statement in Rashi is that Yaakov was reading the Shema because, as he says in the very next verse, I will now die, or I can die now. And what a Jew does when feeling death approaching is to recite the Shema. On a deeper level, of course, Yaakov is taking all of the feelings that he's feeling right now and elevating them for the purpose of expressing his connection and love for Hashem, and he does so through the recitation of the Shema. That's the way that Rashi understands this. The Ramban has a few other ideas. According to the Ramban, when the Torah says, and he appeared to him, according to the Ramban, it means that Yosef appeared to Yaakov. And the Ramban's understanding of this is that Yaakov had already begun to lose his sight because he was old. He was 130 years old. Kvar hayu einav einei Yisrael kvedim. They were already heavy. His sight was difficult because he was getting old, and therefore, from a distance, Yaakov could not make out that it was Yosef, especially because of the way that Yosef was dressed. He wasn't dressed in a familiar way. He was dressed like an Egyptian. But when Yosef got close enough to Yaakov, then at first he wasn't recognizable. But then when he got close enough, Vayera, he was seen by Yaakov. In other words, he was discerned. Yaakov was able to make out that it was Yosef. And then when the verse says that he fell on his neck, it's not Yosef that does this, but it's really Yaakov. Yaakov is the one who falls on Yosef's neck. The opposite of what Rashi said. And he cries a great deal. And as for the word od, the Ramban takes issue with translating the word od as meaning a great deal. The Ramban says that the word od doesn't usually mean that. It means further, more. And the way that the Ramban explains it, it means that he cried now in addition to all of those many years that he had cried in the past. He'd been crying for 22 years, so he cried again, according to the Ramban. He cried again, as he had, in addition to crying before. And as for this crying, why does the Ramban think it's more likely that that Yaakov is doing all the crying? He asks a rhetorical question, which is, Mi dimato mitsuya, whose tears would be more common, more ready? Im ha'em ha'av hazaken, the old father, hamotzeet banav chai la'achar hayeush, who finds his son alive after hayeush ve'ha'evel, after the despair and grief, o haben, or the son who is a ruler. Much more likely, he says, just from a human perspective, says the Ramban, it's much more likely that Yaakov, who's been living in doubt about the existence of Yosef, or he was in grief over Yosef for 22 years, makes much more emotional sense, shall we call it, that Yaakov is the one who is crying at this very, very delicate moment. So we see that based on the very same verses, we have two completely different ways, virtually opposite ways of reading who's doing the crying. Whether according to Rashi, Yosef is doing the crying, whether according to the Ramban, Yaakov is doing all of the crying and saying, "Well, now I can die. Now that I've seen you alive." An interesting disagreement between these two, and of course, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. It's possible to learn the Torah in many, many different ways. Well, I thank you very much for joining me again for Parasha Highlights and Insights. We'll see what happens next week's Parasha and the final portion of Sefer Bereshit, the end of the life of Yaakov and of Yosef as well, and the preparation for the next phase of Jewish history, which will be in the book of Shemot. But until then, thank you all very much for joining me. This is Rabbi Avraham Fisher for Parasha Highlights and Insights saying Shalom.